Welcome to Day 3 of the Florida Historical Society Virtual Annual Meeting and Symposium. I'm Ben Brotemarkle, Executive Director of the Florida Historical Society. The theme for our conference this year is 2020 Hindsight, How Florida's Past Informs Our Present and Future. While COVID-19 forced us to cancel plans for our in-person gathering this past May, I hope you'll agree that this has been a very stimulating and thought-provoking conference so far. Today we have another interesting panel discussion called 100 Years of the 19th Amendment, Florida Women Breaking Barriers. FHS President Emily Liska will moderate a conversation with public historian Dr. Peggy McDonald, Dr. Kimberly Wilmot Voss from the University of Central Florida, and Dr. Zohara Simmons from the University of Florida in Gainesville. Stay with us after the panel discussion for our membership meeting to find out about all of the exciting activities of the Florida Historical Society. First, though, the session 100 Years of the 19th Amendment, Florida Women Breaking Barriers.
Hello and welcome everyone to 100 Years of the 19th Amendment, Florida Women Breaking Barriers. This is a panel for the Florida Historical Society fall meeting. The meeting taking place virtually for the first time in Florida Historical Society's history. And I'm very excited as the leader of the panel, and in fact should introduce myself. I'm Emily Liska. I'm president of the Florida Historical Society. And so excited to have a panel on this topic, and even more excited about the women presenters today. And I'm going to give you detail about them, but first I'll say the presenters are Dr. Peggy McDonald, Dr. Zohara Simmons, and Dr. Kimberly Wilmot Voss. And so I'd like to go one by one and tell you a little bit about each of our brilliant panelists and the reasons they were asked to serve on this panel today or be part of the panel. First, Dr. Peggy McDonald. She's a public historian and adjunct professor at Stetson University and Indian River State College. A native Floridian, Dr. McDonald is a popular and active presenter throughout the state with Florida Humanities. For years, she's presented on the road and in more recent months, virtually. And on a personal note, Dr. McDonald, I'd like to tell you, your lecture at Jacksonville Beach's History Museum on March the 5th was my last evening outing prior to a COVID-19, now 7-month isolation. And if I had to do it all over again, I'd attend your lecture again. It was a wonderful evening. You spoke that time on Florida's Forgotten Female Pioneers. And just a few of your other topics include Florida women fighting for suffrage, Florida's first ladies, and topics relating to the Florida citrus industry and the Florida environment. Dr. McDonald has written about local and Florida history for Forum Magazine, Gainesville Magazine, Our Town Magazine, and Senior Times. Her first book, Marjorie Harris Carr, Defender of Florida's Environment, was published by the University Press of Florida in 2014. She's currently working on a book about Florida's female pioneers. Dr. McDonald is an alum of the University of Florida, where she received a PhD in American history. She served as executive director of Matheson History Museum in Gainesville from 2015 to 2019. And I think some people watching today and listening today might have read your most recent article in Forum Magazine and I think in Gainesville Magazine about the women's suffrage movement. So very exciting to have that in such recent times. I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Gwendolyn Zohara Simmons. She was born and reared in Memphis and is the great-granddaughter of a slave. She taught civil rights history at the University of Florida for 20 years. She was part of the African American Studies faculty and was affiliated faculty in the Women's Studies Department. She retired from the university in 2019, receiving the distinction of Professor Emerita. Dr. Simmons was introduced to the civil rights movement in childhood. And as a student at Spelman College in 1962, embraced the opportunity for active involvement. She has a long history in the area of civil rights, human rights, and peace work. For 23 years, Dr. Simmons was on the staff of the American Fringe Service Committee, a Quaker Peace, Justice, Human Rights, and International Development organization headquartered in Philadelphia. In earlier years as a college student, and thereafter, she was active with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and spent 7 years working full-time on voter registration and desegregation activities in Mississippi, Georgia, and Alabama during the height of the civil rights movement of the 60s. And in Mississippi, she experienced the challenges and the dangers during the Freedom Summer of 1964. She's connected to a who's who in the nation's mid-century civil rights movement. Dr. Simmons is the author of numerous articles, including Racism in Education, published in the University of Florida Journal of Law and Public Policy, Martin Luther King Revisited, A Black Power Feminist Pays Homage to the King, found in the Journal of Feminist Studies and Religion, and Mama Told Me Not to Go, publisher Pearson Prentice Hall. She received her PhD in religion with a focus on Islam and women's studies from Temple University. I'd like to introduce you now to our third panel member, Dr. Kimberly Wilmot Voss. She's a full professor at the University of Central Florida. She's published 4 books in the past 6 years. Her first book in 2014, co-authored with colleagues, Mad Men and Working Women. Her book, The Food Section, Newspaper Women and the Culinary Community, earned the 2014 award for service to food journalism from the Association of Food Journalists. More than a dozen media articles have been published about the book. Her third book, Politicking Politely, published in 2017, Politicking Politely, better still, Well-Behaved Women Making a Difference in 1960s and the 1970s, was published in 2017. She also authored the 2018 book, Reevaluating Women's Page Journalism in the Post-World War II Era. Her book tells the stories of significant women's page journalists who contributed to the women's liberation movement and the journalism community. These women were smart, feisty, and ahead of their times. The book provides a broader understanding of women's page journalism in the 1950s and 1960s. She's published more than 30 articles about women and journalism history, including articles in the publications American Journalism, Journalism History, and Journalism and Mass Communication Quarterly, and in the Florida Historical Society's very own academic journal, the Florida Historical Quarterly. Among those articles for the Quarterly, is one in particular I want to mention, the Florida Fight for Equality, the Equal Rights Amendment, Senator Laurie Wilson, and mediated cat fights in the 1970s. And that'll be a subject of interest for today's panel. She's often the featured presenter at technical, professional, and academic associations throughout the nation, as well as a past chair of the History Division of the Association for Education and Journalism and Mass Communication, and on the publications board for the American Journalism Historians Association. You've likely had the opportunity to hear her quoted on her research, perhaps on NPR, the BBC, or maybe written up in the Columbia Journalism Review. Among classes Dr. Voss teaches at UCS is one of her own creation, a social media writing course. And for that pursuit, Dr. Voss, we all thank you. So we have an exciting, yes, it's a pleasure. Hi, Dr. Voss. Hi, everyone. It's such a pleasure to have you here today. We're here, it's been so long now since I said the title, but we're taking a look at the Florida suffrage movement and beyond, voting rights in Florida for all, really. And certainly we're pursuing it on a lot of venues, and we have the experts here. When we talk about voting rights for women and the 19th Amendment, You can hearken back to the earliest days of the movement, and that takes you to Seneca Falls in 1848. And in 1848, I think a lot of people forget that Florida was a howling wilderness. We'd had statehood for 3 years only. Communication was very limited. We didn't have much of a method at all. And goodness, transportation was still close to 2 decades away with train travel, Western Union as our communicating factor. So getting to a convention in 1948 from Florida would have been a months-long journey. And I thought what we would do is start with Peggy and have her address for us some of the early days of the movement, so we can put the Florida movement in perspective with the national movement.
Thank you. That is quite an effort getting through all those introductions. You did a marvelous job.
Thank you, Dr. McDonald. Thank you.
Madam President, I would like to start with going back even before Seneca Falls. So Seneca Falls is typically where we begin to discuss the origins of the movement for the right to vote, right? An amendment to the Constitution. And I'd like to note that yesterday was Constitution Day, so it was signed 233 years ago. So it's appropriate to be looking at the origins of the 19th Amendment and the origins of the suffrage movement. But we really need to go back farther to the revolution itself to understand women's status. What were women rebelling against when they were pushing for suffrage? So Abigail Adams in 1776 in March wrote a letter to her husband, John Adams, who was working with the leaders of the revolution to shape the direction of the emergent United States. And she wrote a series of letters, but in March of 1776, she asked her husband, John, to remember the ladies in the new code of laws that they were certainly going to be working on. And this is the precursor to the Constitution. So 1776, of course, we have the Declaration of Independence, which implicitly Thomas Jefferson did not intend to include women. In all of his vast writings, he never wrote about women. But in 1776, the Articles of Confederation were the guiding document that carried the United States through the revolution. And Abigail Adams reminded John Adams that he should do better, right? They should do better than their ancestors, and that all husbands would be tyrants if they could. So the legal precedent for what was going on is known as coverture, and this comes from English common law. So that goes back even farther to Mary Wollstonecraft. And she wrote in 1792, after Abigail Adams made her case to include women in the revolution, she wrote from England that the vindication of the rights of women. So the state of coverture, both in Europe and in the new United States, reduced women and their children to the status of the property of their husbands. So there was no concept, for instance, of rape, marital rape, right? Women who, once they married, they lost all rights to property. They lost the rights to their identity legally. And they even lost the rights to what would happen to their children. They had no control. If the marriage ended, the children were the property of the husband. So when we fast forward then to 1848 at Seneca Falls, what we see is not only a call for suffrage, that's the most famous result of the convention, but also a challenge to coverture, a push for equality. So in the Declaration of Sentiments that was signed by over 100 of the more than 300 men and women who attended the conference, it mirrors the Declaration of Independence, and women are making the case for equality to men. What the precursor to the Seneca Falls Convention, however, was 8 years before, in 1840, when American and English women went to the World Anti-Slavery Convention in London. So again, 1840. And the American female delegates were not seated because American and English men refused to seat female delegates. So as Shirley Chisholm said 2 centuries later, when you aren't offered a seat at the table, bring a folding chair. Well, they didn't have folding chairs yet in 1848, so the women stood in the gallery. They couldn't be part of the formal process of the World Anti-Slavery Conference, but they stood and they wanted to be inserted into that moment. And they realized after that that they needed a convention, they needed to work for their own rights. So this is where we have the birth of the women's suffrage movement in the broader movement to end slavery. However, as noble as that sounds, there's a long tension between white and Black, male and female activists for suffrage. So Sojourner Truth is an example of that. She was 6 feet tall, the same height as Frederick Douglass, had a very deep voice, and had been owned by 4 different slave owners. And when she made her Ain't I a Woman speech, she was making the case that, first of all, slavery, often thought of as a male institution, included women and children. And secondly, that the movement for women's rights included Black women. So there was a tension from the beginning between white women working for an end to slavery and working for women's rights, but at the same time not necessarily embracing equality for Black women. In terms of Florida and where Florida fits into this narrative, Florida in 1920, at the time of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, had fewer than 1 million residents. So it was the first colony, often overlooked. People look at Virginia and Massachusetts, but as historian Michael Gannon wrote, by the time Jamestown was established, St. Augustine was well into urban renewal. But as a Spanish colony, Spain treated Florida as a military outpost. Unlike England, they didn't bring women and children to colonize. They just wanted to protect their interests in the rest of Central and South America and North America from England. So Florida was not populated in the same way as the other early colonies. And at the time of statehood, 1845, so just 3 years before Seneca Falls, Florida was a thriving slave state. It was, at the time of the Civil War, about 51% enslaved, about 51% Black, and about 49% white. And in terms of women, the women were either enslaved, or they were in the position of the slave mistress, or they were in some other form of agricultural work. So Florida was rural, it was agricultural, and you didn't yet have the major centers of activism that you had in the North. Typically, people, well, I'm not going to say people, Elizabeth Taylor, and not that one, wrote a history in the Florida Historical Quarterly, an article that came out in the 1950s about Florida's suffrage movement. And she credited Ella Chamberlain with jumpstarting it in 1892. So a little later than the northern states, but she came from Iowa. And it's interesting because Mary Safford from Orlando was the president later of the Equal Suffrage League of Orlando, and Florida, also president of the Iowa Equal Suffrage League. So there's this Iowa connection, right? Ella Chamberlain moved here in 1892. She really kickstarted the movement with, and this is something that Dr. Voss could discuss, her column in the Tampa Morning Tribune. So she used the power of the pen to push for women's rights. However, her view was that white women should be able to vote. She wrote that no woman should be represented by the votes of the Negro or the alien. So she had an anti-immigrant, anti-Black view. So this is the origins, right, of Florida's suffrage movement, something to keep in mind. The United Daughters of the Confederacy were also entwined, right? So when we look at other examples of suffragists in Florida and across the nation, they were often also members of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, and that's the group that put the Confederate statues all over Florida and all over the South. I'd like to stop there because I'm only one part of the panel, and I think that's a good leading up to where we're discussing Florida suffrage, and I'm going to stop now.
Well, on a little bit of a personal note, there are two women on this panel who actually have grandmothers not allowed, who were born into a world of no suffrage, at least for them, and perhaps I'm one of them. And of course, Dr. Simmons, you told me about your grandmother, and she was a great influence on your life. My grandmother was born in Stark, Florida in 1898. I discovered your grandmother was born in 1898, and you have more memories of what she taught you about voting rights than I do. I sadly neglected to ask questions, but if you'll tell us about your personal experience a little bit there.
Thank you very much for your wonderful introduction, and I'm happy to be on the panel as the non-historian. My grandmother, Rhoda Douglas, who, as you noted, was born in 1898. She was born in Arkansas, but moved to Memphis, Tennessee as a young person. And while many, many Black men and women were unable to vote across the South, and of course, this was one of the reasons that I joined the civil rights movement to try and change that. My grandmother, living in Memphis, Tennessee, had been able to register as soon as women in Tennessee were able to. And she voted in every election and was very adamant about it, and went door to door during all elections trying to get people to commit to vote, going with people to the poll to register, etc. So she had a profound influence on me and the work that I would do as a young adult and later to get voting rights for Black people across the South.
And when we talk about those rights, they were such a long time coming. I know Florida was accused by Susan B. Anthony in 1902 of as the one state that had never stepped up to do anything for the woman's suffrage movement, as she called it. And then, you know, there was activity, as Peggy's already pointed out, Dr. McDonald's already pointed out. And some of that activity was meaningful, other activity maybe not that productive. And some of the Florida women were at odds about the best way to proceed. And there were, and this was years, they would go to the Florida legislature year after year, not exactly that, typically on an every other year schedule as the legislature had in those days. And they would, of course, try to get something done for women's suffrage, at least on the state level, if not beyond. Later on in 1920, there was more activity. I want to see if anybody wants to address any of the specific women, because there were a cadre of them here in Florida. And I think most of you are familiar with them. You start by looking at people like Mayman Jennings, you look at Helen Hunt, and of course, Mary McLeod Bethune. These were all principals either directly in the women's suffrage movement at the time to try to get that 19th Amendment ratified, or certainly later on. You can have an amendment ratified, but you've got to have registered voters who can actually access the polls. So would anybody like to mention that long journey? Yeah, please, Dr. Voss.
I think it's worth mentioning Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. We think of her as an environmentalist, right, who's done so much for Florida, but she went down and testified trying to get suffrage to pass in court, right? Another example of a journalist who was trying to do these things. I distinctly remember her writing that no one paid any attention to her or the other women that probably Peggy knows a little bit better than I do. But she mentioned, going down there in their white gloves and their hats, because that was kind of the agency that you worked within, right? Because being too angry or upset wouldn't help. But I don't think enough attention is paid to Marjory Stoneman Douglas and the fact that she did try to work for suffrage in Florida.
And so, Peggy, would you like to, or would you elaborate on some of the women who you really think made the most impact in Florida, at least were the most visible? And even if Florida did not make the biggest difference in the end, of course, there was that 1969 vote that was so meaningful. And maybe we better address that for those who do not feel, who don't feel as spurred as I guess all of us do. And but some of the women who were contributors and at least made the issue visible to Florida women during the time. So would you address some of those women and some of the issues?
I could be so much briefer than going over the theoretical framework like I did earlier. My apologies for that. But Mary Safford, based in Orlando, really kind of took off where Ella Chamberlain had stopped. When Ella Chamberlain and her husband left the state after the great freezes of 1894 to 95, wreaked havoc on their citrus crops. So by 1897, she left, and Elizabeth Taylor has written that there was a lull in the movement after that. 1912, the Orlando mayor encouraged all freeholders to register to vote. A group of women went down to register to vote, and the city attorney informed them that they could not because the Florida Constitution prevented women from voting. Well, this led ultimately to Mary Safford, who was an experienced suffragist in Iowa, had been a Unitarian minister, where even to this day, if you think about it, there are not very many female ministers. Against her family's wishes, she became one. So she became the head of the Orlando and then the state Equal Suffrage League. So the focus was from the national, affiliating with the national women's suffrage movement of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony towards the Florida Equal Suffrage Association. And so she was one person who really helped revive the movement. One of the most famous ones for her militancy was Mary Nolan, and she's another example of someone who was affiliated with the United Daughters of the Confederacy and the suffrage movement. She was born in Virginia in 1842 and then moved to Jacksonville, which became a hotbed for suffrage activity. And she was known for being arrested multiple times, once for actually burning one of Woodrow Wilson's speeches in Washington, D.C., and she was the only Florida suffragist to have her imprisonment narrative published. It was published in The Suffragist in 1917. And at the same time, to be in her 70s and to be repeatedly abused during that night of terror, as she wrote about, and to continue to be arrested was notable for Florida. But Mary McLeod Bethune, her activities are overlooked. Ida B. Wells is just starting to get attention in the national suffrage narrative for her refusal to march at the back of the 1913 suffrage parade in Washington, D.C. And she inserted herself between two white women and marched with the Illinois delegation. Meanwhile, in Florida and at the national level, Dr. Bethune was instrumental in protecting not only Black women's right to vote, but also Black men's. She opened her school that became Bethune-Cookman University at night to teach reading classes. And that would allow Black male and female voters to pass the literacy test and vote. She went on her bicycle door to door to collect money for a poll tax fund to help Black voters pay the poll tax. And she established the Florida Federation of Colored Women's Clubs, because the largest organization for women in Florida, the Florida Federation of Women's Clubs, was white only, as most states were segregated by race. So we really can't say enough about Mary McLeod Bethune's efforts during the suffrage movement and her work for civil rights and voting rights. I did leave out Mayman Jennings, who was president of the Florida Federation of Women's Clubs, and in 1915 convinced that 10,000 member organization to support women's suffrage. and they lobbied the Florida legislature to amend the state constitution to allow women to vote and to support the 19th Amendment, known as the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, to have an amendment to the US Constitution.
And I think it's remarkable when you know the Florida legislature was in session when the 19th Amendment came out of Congress, and it was ready for ratification. We could have had the historic distinction of being the first state to ratify, or the governor could have called the legislature into session later on. We well may have been the Tennessee of the day, but we certainly would have had the opportunity. And there were a lot of excuses used by our state legislators, many which have been mentioned. And even on the national level, the two Florida senators were certainly in the minority when the 19th Amendment finally passed the Senate, as neither stepped up to vote in favor of that amendment. And certainly a huge disappointment, saying they really supported it, but they did not vote for it, gave reasons that were rather weak, I think, in the eyes of most women suffragists. I'd like to this history is so long, and we're going to try to get back to it before the panel ends, but I want to jump off for a minute and talk about what is almost a movement that I say, and I'm happy to be corrected, that mirrored this movement for the 19th passage of the 19th Amendment and in Florida. And that was the Equal Rights Amendment. It's, like the amendment that it never ends, it's out there. And what is the legal status of it still to this day? And I would like certainly Dr. Voss, who's done some brilliant work in that area, to address the topic.
Thank you. It is very exciting to celebrate 100 years of suffrage, but I think it's important to remember it was only 1923 that women said, well, that's great, we have the right to vote. We'd like equal rights on a number of legal levels. And it just never, to this day, as you mentioned, has happened. Florida became a very important battleground state in the 1970s. It seemed as though things were going well, that we, kind of like you mentioned, we could have been the Tennessee of the ERA, but we could not get enough support. One of the women I study, Senator Laurie Wilson, those of you that know Cocoa Beach, the park that you go to that's very, very beautiful on the beach, she's much more than that. She really was one of the only women in the Florida State House at all to push for the Equal Rights Amendment. And looking back at it, she was fighting for what seems like a small thing nowadays, but back then it was a big deal in the 1970s. And it's also worth mentioning in the 1970s, she ran and won as an independent. So for every election, she had to run against two other parties. It was a significant thing. And things like women in the military, which now, of course, we take for granted, bathroom rights for men and women, right, which we've debated for a while, gay marriage, some of the things that nowadays we should have, we still don't have the ERA. And Laurie fought very hard for these things. And she, again, was one of the only women to do this. And she had to do this every single year in the Senate. And she had Elaine Gordon in the House that she worked with. Elaine Gordon wanted to be known as Ms. instead of Mrs. or Miss. And the Florida House would not allow her to do that. So she took black duct tape and she put between the I and the S so she could be Ms. Right? I think it's important to talk about how many things women had to fight for. Right? I mean, there was a lot. We begin with the right to vote, which is, of course, is a foundation that's very important. But there were constant rights that women had to fight for. And the theory was in the 1970s, if Florida went yes for the ERA, so would other southern states. And it never happened. It got close time and again, but it never actually happened. Laurie ends up not being part of the Senate by 1980. And she died within the last year or two, and no one has ever talked about it. She had a very small obit in the newspaper, but she really was a pioneer. And I think that's the other thing that's important. As we talk about 100 years of the vote, which is great, I hope we don't forget these women that came after, because there were so many in Florida that were just amazing. As I mentioned to you earlier, Roxy Bolton in Miami. She was someone who was an early member of NOW and recognized that one of the challenges for women pioneers by the time we get to the 60s and 70s in Florida was no childcare. So she opened her house to have all the children of these women come in so they could be taken care of, because otherwise these women didn't have, right, the childcare that, you know, we kind of take for granted sometimes. Women in Florida were, they were pioneers. They had to kind of deal with the challenges of the South, but many of them did things that I don't think Florida gets enough recognition for.
On the other hand, it did get a little national coverage when the state legislature voted this down. Was that the final 75 when they finally brought it up and it didn't pass? It did get some national NBC, ABC, CBS, yes, all the biggies at the time. And, but you also in your work, correct me if I get this wrong, place some blame on the media for focusing more on female cat fights than the real issues at hand. And you want to discuss that a minute?
If you kind of follow what happened nationally for the Equal Rights Amendment, Florida was the perfect case study for that. Laurie Wilson, a lawyer, a very smart lady, was gorgeous. She was the Gloria Steinem of Florida, if you will, in the fact that she was very beautiful, very photogenic. She also always wore a white pantsuit. So, you know, she was that person. And we also had our own Phyllis Schlafly, if you will, someone that was against the ERA in Florida. And I think that was often the concept. If we pit women against each other and they can't get along, well, how can the men know what to do, right? It was kind of that idea.
Yeah.
And, you know, if you think about Phyllis Schlafly, who was also a lawyer, who had many children and traveled the country, she couldn't have done that without what women's liberation had done. She didn't get her law degree until she was in her 40s, something that was not typical often for women or men for that matter. My favorite story is about Phyllis Schlafly in Illinois. Was she encouraged women to make bread for the lawmakers under the idea that women should be home making bread. And wouldn't we all be happier with homemade bread? Because homemade bread is nice, right? Oh my goodness. Having lived in Illinois for quite a while, the number of people that got sick because the women didn't know how to make good bread.
I was going to say
the story.
Story.
I mean,
that's correct.
I mean, good bread's good bread, but a lot of the women made the worst bread, and the lawmakers got sick. The media never covered that. It was too easy, right, to do the women not getting along, because it was an automatic frame. But a lot of women, I think, that even fought against the ERA, as time went on, really appreciated what they would have gotten through the Equal Rights Amendment.
I want to thank you so much. I want to jump back about a decade, because before the Equal Rights Amendment was so actively on the scene in Florida, it was out there certainly. We're dealing with a broader issue even, and this was the civil rights movement, the movement of the 60s. And it's a time, you know, that we still don't have the Civil Rights Voting Act. And so, Hara, you have quite the stories to tell. You've already told us about your very earliest years and sort of being schooled at your grandmother's knee about the importance of voting. And if you could maybe pick up back in the days when you were at Spelman, and what you did, your personal involvement in the voting rights movement, and particularly your work in the South.
Certainly, thank you. Yes, you know, when we talk about, as my colleagues have noted beautifully, you know, we can focus on 100 years ago when women got the right to vote, or supposedly that Black men got the right to vote with the 15th Amendment. But when we really look at the history of our country, we know that this was not the case. And certainly in my own life, having gone off to Spelman as the first person in my family to get a college education, and being told by my grandmother who raised me, in spite of all that she had shown me in her own life, she said, don't get involved. And I really had not planned to, but you know, once I got to Atlanta, which was at that time a hotbed of student activism, I got involved, and it was marching and sitting in and all of that, and meeting people who were already full-time SNCC people, that I started hearing these horrific stories, particularly from Mississippi.
And Zahara, for the few people who don't know what SNCC is, would you give us the long version?
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you.
All right, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, known as SNCC, SNCC. When I met a number of the SNCC staff who would come in from Mississippi for meetings and hear that people had been shot, people had their homes bombed, firebombed, all because they tried to register to vote. Well, I was in a state of shock and I really became angry. And so I decided that I had to go to Mississippi for the Mississippi Freedom Summer Project of 1964. And of course, I had no idea how dangerous it was going to be. And when I got assigned to a place on the southeast side of the state called Laurel, Mississippi, it was so dangerous there. In fact, the leader of the Ku Klux Klan lived there, Sam Bowers, who was involved with a number of killings of Black people in the state. Let me just say, the whole idea behind Mississippi Freedom Summer was that we would have 1,000 college students fan out across the state, and most of whom would be white, to expose to the world the dangers that Black people faced if they even attempted to register. So when I was assigned to Laurel and I was told it was too dangerous for even white volunteers to be sent, and I was one of the few Black volunteers, I became quite terrified of the idea. Nonetheless, having gone there and got a project going and sort of opening up the county, as we said, Jones County, Free Jones County, we won't go into why it's called that, but we did have some 23 volunteers, most of whom were white. And, you know, we were shot at, homes were burned, crosses put on lawns, and our first office firebombed and burned because the fire department would not put it out. The second office firebombed, but thankfully the community were able to put it out. I mean, these were such dangerous times. So when we talk about women who were in the forefront of getting the right to vote, we have to extend it to the 60s, the 50s, and the 60s, when you have people like Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer, who was beaten within an inch of her life for trying to register to vote, who became one of the prominent leaders in the state. There were many women across that state and in Alabama who were leading in the struggle to get the right to vote. So we have to understand that for many of us, the right to vote was not guaranteed until the passage of the 1964 Voting Rights Act. And now we see in our current time that even that has been eviscerated, and many of our rights to vote are really now being attacked, as we all know. So do
you want to expand on that just a little bit? Go ahead and expand on that.
Yes, certainly. The fact that we have gerrymandering in many of our states, so that even the one person, one vote doesn't have the impact that it normally would have. We have the Supreme Court take out one of the important provisions of the Voting Rights Act, which has weakened it. Now we're having, with us living in this era of COVID, when it's very dangerous for people to go out and be in crowds. Many of our states are closing down voting poll stations, making more people have to congregate in one place to vote, and people are afraid to do that, particularly older people. So that will cut back on the number of people to vote. We have a campaign coming out of the national office saying that to vote by mail is, not, the votes are not going to be counted, or people will try and vote 2 or 3 times. I mean, all kinds of confusion. So we can see that to this very moment, our vote is not insured.
So when Mayman Jennings started the League of Women Voters, a few years, I think it was at Peggy, Dr. McDonald, you mentioned the date roughly, but a few years after the passage of the 19th Amendment, this was really meaningful to have a League of Women Voters, but one group alone is not the only group that can follow, that needs to follow through with action, as proven by the decades of activism and what has happened, particularly throughout the South, but all through the nation. I wanted to ask Dr. McDonald if she would quickly, as an offshoot of what Dr. Simmons was talking about, would you just mention right after the 19th Amendment was passed, so we're going back in time again to 1920, there were 2 just shocking episodes in Florida history, 2 that I can think of, both massacres, one connected to the actual presidential election and election of 1920, and another just a couple of years later. Would you mention them at least briefly? We have a little bit of time left.
Sure. At that time, Florida was really the per capita lynching capital of the nation. So the 19-teens and 1920s were a very dangerous time, not only to be Black, but to be Black and attempting to vote. So in 1920, so the year that the 19th Amendment was ratified, went into effect, in Ocoee, when Black residents tried to vote, there was a massacre that resulted in the town becoming all white, with deaths and destruction of Black property. And Black residents didn't start to come back to Ocoee for generations. 3 years later, January 23, there was a similar destruction of a Black town, Rosewood. So Florida was a dangerous place to try to exercise your right to vote if you were Black, whether you were male or female. And immediately after the 19th Amendment, as Mary McLeod Bethune worked to empower Black male and female voters, the KKK retaliated. They threatened to burn down her school. So according to Leonard Lempel, a historian of Bethune-Cookman University, Dr. Bethune and students held hands and sang, and literally sang the KKK away, but it didn't stop there. The efforts to stop African Americans from voting in Florida and across the South, as Dr. Simmons has mentioned, continued. So this is not a clean date, 1920. In addition to voter suppression of African Americans, across the nation after the 19th Amendment was ratified. Women who were married to foreign nationals lost their citizenship status and could not vote. So there were many ways that the United States government and state governments continued to work to prevent Americans from voting.
And you know, I hope everybody realizes, I'm sure they do, particularly the people tuned into this, because they have such an interest in Florida history, that Mary McLeod Bethune, in 2021, if the schedule stays as we hope it can, should be unveiled in the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. as one of the two statues submitted by Florida, and will be indeed the first Black individual representing a state in the Capitol. And I think that's so very exciting. And you know, speaking of bread, I'm going to get back to Dr. Voss, because you made, don't remind, the story was great about the bread. Mary McLeod Bethune knew how to relate to her constituency and well beyond. And one of the things she told her constituency when she was trying to be impactful about the importance of voting was, eat your bread without jam, but pay your poll taxes. And you know, and that sort of tells you the circumstance. I think we have time. Is there anything anyone would like to add to the discussion? I want to give everybody the opportunity to do that. It's such a talented panel, and you've each had such limited time. I'll start with you, Dr. Voss. Is there anything you would like to add to today's discussion?
I hope that we don't just celebrate 100 years of the right to vote for women, in particular because it was often white women. I hope that we continue to talk about all the things that came after, that women have fought continuously for rights, and that those things don't get lost. I'd hate to think that we wait another 70 years to think about the ERA again, or to think about women's liberation, right? That we don't wait all that time to say that women have fought for things like equal pay, against domestic violence, about daycare. Those things have not gone away, and they continued for decades. A lot of World War II added to that. You know, we had government-sponsored daycare during World War II. The fact that we think it's odd now is sad. I mean, the virus, of course, makes it a challenge. But equal pay has been an argument for decades. Sexual harassment, the lack of women in management, or in all sorts of professions. I hope that we continue to talk about that and don't wait for an anniversary for it to become important.
And I want to thank this enlightened panel for leading discussion in that direction. I may have kept us bogged down in another century, and I'm so grateful for your insight. Dr. Simmons, what would you like to add to today's discussion?
Well, I would like to say to all of those who will be listening and looking at this panel is that racism has played and continues to play a major role in keeping women across the racial spectrum from working together to get the changes that we all need. This is from the very beginning of the struggle for the right to vote for women, and we are still having this problem to this date. So we need to learn this history, we need to learn from this history, and we need to unite as women to get what we need as women. All of the things that Dr. Voss has mentioned that we are sorely in need of today. Thank you.
Peggy.
I think we've seen in this short period of time how important Florida is to this national narrative of suffrage for women, and suffrage going back to 50 years before the 19th Amendment was ratified, suffrage for African-American men in the 15th Amendment. Florida has contributed to this national narrative, and to bring it forward to the mid-20th century, one thing that's often overlooked in the history of the civil rights movement is Florida. One example is Christmas Day, 1951, when Harry T. Moore and his wife Harriet Moore in Sims, Florida, had a bomb explode under their bed. They were both killed. They paid the price for their activism. They were both teachers, and Harry T. Moore was involved with the NAACP in leading a successful campaign to register over 160,000 African-American voters in Florida in 1951. It was a phenomenal task, and they both lost their lives because of it. But we typically hear about Medgar Evers, and outside of Florida, the martyrs of the civil rights movement, but so much took place here, including not only for women's suffrage, but for African-American suffrage.
So you believe Florida, of course, and certainly with the examples you've given, it's been a place that's been active, and certainly stories that should not be lost to, gosh, the populace. And I don't know how many of our school children hear these stories. I don't know how many of our, even those, how many of our students on the college level in Florida are required to take history courses. I think there's maybe just been a little bit of a tweak and a change there. I'm hopeful. These are all important stories to know. I do want to say before we end, like Elaine Gordon, who you brought up earlier, thank you, Dr. Voss, I have such a great respect for titles, and I am just mesmerized by her story that she had to make her own placard, Ms. Gordon. And in that regard, I want to say before we started this panel, I told everybody, I know how long and diligently and the amount of research and tenacious activity to achieve your titles, PhD, doctor of, and I said, and I'm going to call you that. And I have to tell all of our viewers, listeners, you're all such warm, wonderful people, as well as supreme academics. I have morphed into making you all my friends and calling you by your first name as well. But I have so enjoyed the opportunity to present the three of you to the Florida Historical Society membership and to Florida and other listeners, viewers at large. Dr. McDonald, it's been a pleasure. Dr. Voss, sitting in that beautiful view, I'm going to assume on the UCF campus. And yes, shout out to UCF and the place where the Florida Historical Society is published. So we're very proud of UCF and the Florida Historical Society affiliation there. And also I want to thank, of course, Dr. Simmons, who brought us, who reminded us so much of the real life examples we can all relate to in this current 21st century. They were riveting. Everyone was powerful. I thank you for participating in this panel, 100 years of women's suffrage, and we're going to add to that and beyond, beyond, and beyond. And I thank you all for your interest in telling the story of not just women, but everyone in Florida and our nation having access to the vote. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm sure you'll agree that was another stimulating panel. Thanks to the participants. It's time now for the membership meeting portion of our conference. I'll be back later to talk about all of the exciting activities of the Florida Historical Society since we last met. But first, we have some business to take care of. Here's Florida Historical Society President Emily Liska to officially get the meeting started.
Welcome, welcome everybody to the annual meeting 2020 of the Florida Historical Society. First, I call the meeting to order. I do appreciate your attendance at this highly unusual meeting in these highly unusual circumstances. Also, a little bit different procedure than is normal, and I'll start with bringing motions for approval from our membership, and you'll have the opportunity to vote electronically. So let me provide the motions to you for the record and for your approval. I call for votes to approve the extension of the terms of President Emily Liska, President-elect Maurice O'Sullivan, Secretary Casey Smith, and immediate past President Tracy Moore, terms to continue through May 2021. Also attached to that, call for a vote, all the same vote, please, to approve Council Wooten as Vice President through May 2021 of the Florida Historical Society, and to approve as a new board member, James Michael Denham. You'll be able to vote electronically, and you'll hear a little bit more about that in just a minute. In the meantime, thank you for attending the Florida Historical Society's membership meeting. And I want to let you know on behalf of all of the board how much we truly value your membership, and we hope you continue to embrace Florida history. It's because of you we're here, and we will continue as creatively and as much in touch with you as we can continue to be. At this time, Ben Brotemarkle will present his executive director's annual report, followed by adjournment. Ben?
Thanks, Emily. To vote yes or no on the motion presented by Emily Liska, you can email fhsvote@myfloridahistory.org. That's fhsvote@myfloridahistory.org. The vote is for Florida Historical Society members only. If you're not a member of the Florida Historical Society, we'd love to have you join. All you have to do is go to myfloridahistory.org, or you can call 321-690-1971, extension 217. In this virtual format, I'm sure we have a lot of people attending who have not attended a Florida Historical Society annual meeting and symposium before, so I'd like to start with a brief history of our organization. The Florida Historical Society was founded in 1856 in St. Augustine, making us the oldest existing cultural organization in the state. We moved all over the state for about a century and a half, usually associated with one institution of higher learning or another, until we eventually settled here in the early 1990s in historic Cocoa Village in Brevard County. Our state headquarters are located in the Library of Florida History, where we have thousands of rare and out-of-print books, maps dating back to the 1500s, historic photographs, a collection of almost 20,000 historic postcards, all sorts of genealogical information, and great research materials for anyone interested in studying Florida history. We operate the Florida Historical Society Press, which publishes at least 5 books a year, sometimes as many as 10 books a year. People are sometimes surprised that we publish novels as well as nonfiction books, but a lot of teachers tell us that some kids will think that a history book is radioactive or something, but they'll pick up a novel that is based on Florida history and get engaged in the story, and then discover that that's what history is the story of people's lives, and they'll connect to history that way. So we do publish novels as well as nonfiction books. We also reprint historically significant works that have gone out of print. An example of that would be Stetson Kennedy's Palmetto Country. Stetson Kennedy went all throughout the state of Florida in the late 1930s and early 1940s, collecting oral histories of Florida's diverse population, all of the different types of people who were living here at that time. Greek sponge divers in Tarpon Springs, Seminole Indians. He talked with African-American turpentine steel workers, all sorts of different people, and he documented their stories in the book Palmetto Country. It had been out of print for about 20 years, and we added a whole lot of new photographs to it, and I was very happy that we published that, republished his first book. We also published his last book, which was The Florida Slave, and I was sorry that he did not get to see that in its final print version, but he did get to see the cover, and he liked it a lot. Some of the more recent books, the most recent books from the Florida Historical Society Press, include Brim of Panther Clan by Patricia Wickman. She spent 20 years living and working with the Seminole tribe and really has some interesting insights documenting their history that hadn't been documented before. Also, the novel Don't Tell, The Secrets of Pinehurst Seminary which won an award yesterday. Author J.A. Kennedy based that novel on her own family history. And we have a lot of more exciting books coming up, but actually before the end of the year. We also published the Florida Historical Quarterly, which is our academic journal. Dr. Connie Lester is the editor of the Florida Historical Quarterly. It has scholarly articles on a wide variety of topics relating to Florida history and is the primary benefit of membership in the Florida Historical Society. Since 1908, the Florida Historical Quarterly has been an outstanding journal, a critically acclaimed journal, and we're very proud that it's our flagship publication for the Florida Historical Society. The Florida Historical Quarterly is, of course, also sponsoring the Gerald Schaffner Lecture tomorrow night with historian and legal scholar Martha S. Jones, so don't miss that. The Florida Historical Society also owns and operates the Brevard Museum of History and Natural Science in Cocoa, and we like to say the museum covers everything from the Ice Age to the Space Age. It's really fun to watch kids walk into our Ice Age room, even adults walk into our Ice Age room and see the mastodon skeleton and the giant sloth and just look up and wonder at these huge skeletons. And we also have a lot of pioneer displays and all the way through the space program, and we have huge photographs from the Hubble Space Telescope in one room. It's just a really fascinating museum sitting on 21 acres of nature preserve. There's trails through 21 acres of 3 different Florida ecosystems. The centerpiece, though, of the Brevard Museum of History and Natural Science is the People of Windover exhibit. In 1982, a backhoe operator named Steve Vanderjack was clearing away muck near the intersection of I-95 and State Road 50 in Titusville, and it was for a new subdivision called Windover Farms. And he noticed that he'd uncovered this round, brownish object in his backhoe. He got off his backhoe and looked at this thing, and it saw that it was staring back at him. He'd uncovered a human skull, and he saw that he'd uncovered several sets of human remains. Well, it was pretty quickly determined that this was not a serial killer's burial ground or something. So a young up-and-coming archaeologist named Glenn Doran from Florida State University was called in, and he knew right away that these were old bones, probably Native American bones from at least 400 years ago. But everyone was shocked to discover, when the carbon dating was done, that these remains were between 7,000 and 8,000 years old. Hugely old remains, ancient remains, but very, very well preserved in this peat bog. They had used this, the Windover people had used this same pond as a cemetery for over a century. And we don't know how much they knew about the pH balance or the anaerobic environment that preserved these remains, but they were obviously in touch with nature, and these bodies were all buried in relatively the same position, wrapped in the oldest woven cloth found in North America. The preservation was so good that 91 of the skulls had intact brain matter. Just an amazing discovery, one of the most important archaeological discoveries in the world. And we have the only exhibit of actual artifacts from the Windover people at the Brevard Museum of History and Natural Science. Pictured here is Holly Baker, our director of the Brevard Museum of History and Natural Science. She's the one on top. Below her is the Windover woman. And we had sculptor Brian Owens, whose work you might know from his St. Augustine Foot Soldiers Monument. It's a bronze sculpture of participants in the civil rights movement in St. Augustine, right near the slave market there in the park downtown. We commissioned him to do a Windover woman sculpture, which is a very realistic portrayal of someone who lived here between 7,000 and 8,000 years ago. He took measurements from an actual skull from Windover to create the same way the FBI or other law enforcement agencies would do a forensic reconstruction to determine what a crime victim might have looked like. The same thing was done for the Windover woman. So it's a really fascinating sculpture and very lifelike. And you can look right in the eyes of this prehistoric woman from Brevard County. The Brevard Museum of History and Natural Science is also home to our Florida Historical Society Archaeological Institute. And Florida Historical Society established the Archaeological Institute about 6 years ago to kind of reclaim our statewide leadership in archaeology. The Florida Historical Society has been preserving prehistoric items and prehistory for more than a century. We were the first to collect Native American relics. We were the first to promote and publish archaeological research. Archaeologist Clarence B. Moore was an FHS member starting in 1907 and donated his written works to our library. Archaeologists have kind of a love-hate relationship with Clarence B. Moore because he was a man of his time in the late 19th and early 20th centuries when archaeology was just really starting out as a discipline. And so he was great at documenting a lot of the archaeological discoveries that he made in Florida, but he also destroyed a lot of burial mounds and other mounds in the process. So it would have been nice if he had used modern archaeological techniques, but at least he was great at documenting what he did find. The Florida Historical Society also helped to create the position of the Florida State Archaeologist, and we created the Florida Anthropological Society. The Florida Anthropological Society, which is a great organization on its own now, started out as a committee of the Florida Historical Society. And as the Florida Historical Society Archaeological Institute, we publish an annual magazine, Adventures in Florida Archaeology, and we go to their conference, the Florida Anthropological Society, to distribute that full-color magazine each year. The Florida Historical Society also manages the historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens in Eau Gallie. It's a wonderful museum. The last resident of the home was Caroline P. Rossiter. And in 1920, at the age of 23, her father died. He had been the Standard Oil agent for what is now the Space Coast region. And when he died, Caroline wanted to continue that family business. So as the story goes, she went up to Kentucky to the board of directors meeting at Standard Oil. She listened at the keyhole while they argued about whether or not to let her have this important position. And finally somebody said, "Oh, let the little lady have it. She'll fail in a year and we'll give it to a man." Well, Caroline Rossiter didn't last a year. She lasted 62 years, becoming the longest running Standard Oil agent in the country. We have a nice handwritten note from Ronald Reagan congratulating her on her retirement in 1985 and her long career. And Carrie Rossiter lived to be over 100 years old, and we proudly operate her house as a house museum that celebrates Florida history and pioneer history and women's history in Florida. The Florida Historical Society does a lot of things that you might not consider to be necessarily normal operating procedure for a historical society. For example, we stage theatrical presentations. We do whatever it takes to engage people, particularly younger audiences, but people of all ages, in Florida history. You're looking at a picture of our theatrical presentation that we did some years ago now in 2013 called Ponce de Leon Landed Here. People asked me as soon as I came on board as executive director way back in 2008, how are you going to recognize the 500th anniversary of the naming of our state by Ponce de Leon? And as it got closer and closer, it became obvious that different areas of Florida wanted to claim that they were the first place that Ponce de Leon landed. So we decided to have some fun with it while gathering all of the information that we could on Ponce's landing. And so with this courtroom drama, which we staged at actual historic courtroom venues in Palm Beach and Volusia County, the Volusia County performance was simulcast in the Gray Building at the Museum of Florida History in Tallahassee. And we taped it. You can see this production on our website at myfloridahistory.org. We had actual lawyers and judges arguing the four most likely spots that Ponce de Leon landed and presented their arguments in favor of that. Then we had several people give testimony. We had Clarence B. Moore, who I mentioned earlier, one of the first archaeologists in Florida, come on and say that he couldn't really determine through archaeology where Ponce had landed, and none of his successors could either. Then we had the Ice Queen, who saw the three ships of Ponce coming in and saw one taken out to sea, but she testified that we'd built up the coastline so much, who could tell for sure where the landing took place. Then we had Ponce himself testify, and he kind of stood by his navigator, pointing out that it was probably around Ponte Vedra, but even he couldn't be sure. So while the jury deliberated, we had Chris Call, who writes songs about Florida history and culture, play during their deliberations. And as you might expect, the jury came back hopelessly deadlocked and unable to reach a verdict because we don't really know where Ponce landed. But over the course of the trial, we presented all of the information that we did have. So we had fun with it and engaged the public in that way. We have other theatrical presentations like Female Florida, Historic Women in Their Own Words, which we've done twice at the annual Zora Neale Hurston Festival of the Arts and Humanities, as well as in libraries and around the state, and others as well. So we try to be a multifaceted historical society, engaging people however we can. Perhaps our most effective educational outreach is projects and programs are our Florida Frontiers media programs. Florida Frontiers, the weekly radio magazine of the Florida Historical Society, has been on the air for over 12 years now and is broadcast all over the state on NPR affiliates. And it's also archived on our website at myfloridahistory.org. A recent program, we have all sorts of subjects, but a recent program focused on the 60th anniversary of Axe Handle Saturday in Jacksonville, and the program was actually quoted in the Washington Post coverage of Axe Handle Saturday, the anniversary. So that was a nice thing to happen. Our Florida Frontiers television program has also been on the air quite a while. Each episode looks at one subject. Our radio program looks at 3 different subjects each week, but the television program focuses its documentary style and focuses on one topic. And we've covered everything from the indigenous people of Florida to Florida's cracker culture and many other topics. The television program has actually earned national recognition this year from the American Association of State and Local History. AASLH gave us an award of excellence for the episode Free Black Settlements in Spanish Colonial Florida. And again, this is a statewide program airing on PBS affiliates from Key West to the Panhandle and all points in between. But if you can't catch it on your PBS affiliate, our Florida Frontiers Television is archived on our website at myfloridahistory.org. Another program that we have is our Florida Frontiers Festival, which we were holding in October each year. Unfortunately, COVID-19 has changed those plans. It's our own mini Florida Folk Festival where we have musicians from throughout the state play, artists like the Highwayman artists and other vendors at the event. And it's on the campus of our Brevard Museum of History and Natural Science, so people can go in the museum and enjoy exhibits as well. You know, it's temporarily on hold until we know what's happening with the COVID-19 virus, but we've had 5 very successful years of the Florida Frontiers Festival. You're watching the first Florida Historical Society virtual annual meeting and symposium, but this is something we have done, we do every year and have done for many years. We had our first in 1856. There were some years where we didn't have it due to wars and different circumstances, but for the most part, for most of the 20th century and into the 21st century, certainly, we have held the annual meeting and symposium each May. There are scholarly paper presentations, and as you've seen, great panel discussions on a wide variety of topics. Usually, when we're not virtual and we're at a different Florida city each year, we take advantage of the location where we are and do tours of historic sites in the afternoon. We have all sorts of exciting our awards presentation, which hopefully you saw virtually this year, a banquet dinner and many other activities as part of our FHS annual meeting and symposium. And I hope that you are enjoying this virtual version of our conference. In May 2021, we are scheduled to be in Lakeland, Florida. And hopefully this virus will be resolved by then and you'll be able to join us in person in Lakeland. We'll keep you posted on that. If we can't gather in large numbers in person, perhaps we'll have a small group actually in Lakeland and tape something like this, a virtual annual meeting and symposium from Lakeland next year. But hopefully we'll all be able to get together and enjoy meeting in person. The Florida Historical Society operates because of our board of directors and our very talented staff, who we all wear many hats at the Florida Historical Society. Our volunteers, we could not do it without them, but we couldn't do it without you as well, the members of the Florida Historical Society. And if you're not a member of the Florida Historical Society, we would certainly encourage you to become a member. It's very easy to do. All you have to do is go to our website at myfloridahistory.org or call us at 321-690-1971, extension 217. And we'd love to have you as the newest member of the Florida Historical Society. Well, this concludes our annual membership meeting, and to officially bring our annual membership meeting to a close, here's our president, Emily Liska.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you for that very full and insightful report for the membership. I want to thank our membership once again for joining us today. I want to ask them today to continue to support the Florida Historical Society. It's been a unique year. It's been a year of both grand successes and struggling, but we're all still here. And I'm very proud of the Florida Historical Society for what it's accomplished this year. All of its staff members still on board, and so grateful for that. And I'll keep reaching out to you to support our efforts. Become a member if you're not. And with those words, I will adjourn the meeting. Meeting adjourned.
Thanks, Emily. We're not done yet. If you've missed any part of our conference, you can access it anytime at myfloridahistory.org. The Florida Historical Society virtual annual meeting and symposium culminates tomorrow evening at 6 with the Gerald H. Schaffner Lecture on Florida History and Culture presented by the Florida Historical Quarterly and the University of Central Florida. Historian and legal scholar Martha S. Jones will give a presentation called The Right to Vote, Women and Race in the 1920 Election. Martha Jones is professor of history at Johns Hopkins University and will be a dynamic keynote speaker. Go to our website at myfloridahistory.org to find the link to register for this lecture. That part of our event will be coming to you from the University of Central Florida, so for all of us here at the Florida Historical Society Library of Florida History, I want to thank you for joining us. Stay safe and healthy. I'm Ben Brotemarkle.